Good evening, I'm Katie Wilson and you're watching A News. Let's see your headlines. Iran and Israel's ceasefire appears to be holding after days of violence and a direct intervention from the US. US airstrikes did not destroy Iran's nuclear capability according to a preliminary assessment. Leaders of NATO countries conclude the high-stakes summit in The Hague. The US brokered ceasefire has restored a sense of calm in the Middle East, but whether it holds remains uncertain. It follows an angry intervention by US President Donald Trump, who earlier accused both sides of violating the truce.
The ceasefire between Israel and Iran appears to be holding, at least for now, following days of escalating violence and a direct intervention by US President Donald Trump. Both governments have publicly acknowledged that a ceasefire is in effect after 12 days of intense airstrikes, marking the most serious military confrontation between the two regional arch-rivals in recent history. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described the opening strike of Israel's Rising Lion operation as historic, claiming it will be studied by militaries around the world. Yet he made clear that the broader campaign against what he called Iran's axis of terror is far from over. He reiterated Israel's goals, defeating Hamas and securing the return of hostages from Gaza.
Dear citizens of Israel, during the 12 days of the Operation Rising Lion, we achieved a historic victory, and this victory will stand for generations. We removed from upon us two immediate existential threats: the threat of annihilation by nuclear bombs and the threat of annihilation by 20,000 ballistic missiles. If we had not acted now, the state of Israel would soon be facing the danger of annihilation. But that did not happen, because at the decisive moment we rose like a lion, stood tall, and our roar shook Tehran and echoed throughout the world.
Iran, for its part, accused Israel of continuing to breach the ceasefire with drone incursions and targeted attacks. A spokesman for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps warned that hostilities could resume if violations persist.
We warn America and the Israel of the crushing blows of the brave Islamic fighters from the north to the south of the occupied territories, and of the strike on the American base in Al Udeid, which should serve as a lesson. Otherwise, in the next phase, they will face an even more powerful response, with broader targets already designated.
Trump, who brokered the deal, announced the ceasefire early Tuesday. Hours later, he sharply criticised both sides for initial violations. Despite mutual claims of victory, the tone on both sides suggests a pause rather than peace. In Tehran, crowds gathered in Engelab Square in a show of support for the armed forces. While in Israel, Armed Forces Chief of Staff Eyal Zami said the military was at the conclusion of a significant chapter, but the campaign against Iran is not over.
Iran's parliament has voted to suspend cooperation with the UN's nuclear watchdog, accusing it of failing to condemn recent strikes on its nuclear sites. Our correspondent Turay Shiralilu has more from Tehran.
Just a day after the ceasefire, Iran's parliament on Wednesday voted for suspension of the Islamic Republic's ties with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Speaker Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf said that cooperation with the UN watchdog will be suspended due to its failure in condemning the US-Israeli attacks on Iran's civilian nuclear facilities, and that Iran will speed up its nuclear program for peaceful purposes. Tehran has also said that it will lodge a legal complaint against the IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi, for his false reports about Iran's nuclear program, which were used as a pretext for the attacks. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, in an interview with the London-based news outlet Al Arabi Al Jadid, said Tehran's approach to the Non-Proliferation Treaty may undergo a change, but he did not clarify in which direction. Prior to the attacks, Araghchi and the US negotiator Steve Witkoff were due to talk over Iran's alternative proposal to the US draft agreement, suggesting enrichment by a consortium of regional countries. Since April, Tehran and Washington held 5 rounds of indirect talks for removal of the U.S.-imposed sanctions. Their discussions were disrupted by Israel's attacks against Iran on the 13th of June. Despite of the U.S. involvement in the Iran-Israel war and its attacks on Iran's major nuclear sites, Witkoff told the Fox News that Tehran and Washington were already talking to each other. According to the U.S. envoy, the talks were promising, and Washington was hopeful for a long-term deal after the ceasefire. Turad Shiralilu, reporting for A News TV, Tehran.
Donald Trump is doubling down on claims that US strikes on Iran obliterated the country's nuclear facilities. That's despite a preliminary damage assessment from the president's own intelligence agency, which was leaked to the media, suggesting that the airstrikes didn't destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities and may have only set the program back by a few months. Tony Waterman has more from Washington.
These certainly aren't the headlines President Trump was hoping to make while at the NATO summit in the Netherlands. He was hoping to take a victory lap after those surprise airstrikes this past weekend. In his words, completely and totally obliterated Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities. But he's instead been left defending those claims after this leaked U.S. intelligence report found that key components of Iran's nuclear program, like centrifuges and highly enriched uranium, are still largely intact, and that Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon was likely set back by only a few months. The assessment also reportedly found that those bunker-busting bombs didn't cause as much damage as expected, something that Israeli intelligence has also concluded. When asked about this assessment by reporters, Trump tried to cast doubt on the U.S. intelligence, saying that it was inconclusive, that he believes it was total obliteration, and he insisted that Iran's nuclear program has been set back by decades. Trump's team, including the U.S. Defense Secretary, have claimed that this is all politically motivated, that the leaked report is meant to, in their words, demean President Trump and discredit the brave fighter pilots who conducted this mission. And it's important to remember that this is just a preliminary report by just one of the many branches of the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and it's mostly based on aerial satellite images. There aren't agents on the ground jumping into those holes left by the bombs to assess the internal damage at these facilities. So it's still very early in this damage assessment, and things could certainly change going forward. Tony Waterman for A News, Washington.
NATO leaders are wrapping up a high-profile summit in The Hague with major announcements on defence spending and renewed pledges of unity. The event has drawn global attention as heads of state address some of today's most pressing security challenges. Our very own Anita Sharma has more from The Hague.
It's the final and biggest day at the NATO summit here in The Hague. The U.S. president arrived last night, and after a lavish dinner and breakfast with the Dutch king and queen, Donald Trump is now at the summit. At a press conference with the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte called Trump a man of peace and complimented him for brokering the ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Trump also met with Turkey's President Erdogan, their first face-to-face meeting since Trump's return to office. During their 30-minute chat, they discussed the Iran-Israel conflict and the war in Ukraine. They also addressed bilateral ties, including how to boost cooperation in the defense field. On that front, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the U.S. would explore ways to lift defense sanctions against Turkey. Trump is also meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy today. He says they will discuss the obvious. The sit-down would be their first in-person meeting since April, when the two were at the Vatican for the funeral of Pope Francis. He said Zelenskyy has some difficulties, but that he's a nice guy. On NATO, Trump confirmed his commitment to Article 5, a key provision establishing the principle of collective defense. It states that an armed attack against one or more NATO members shall be considered an attack against them all. The U.S. president said he is with them all the way and praised the 5% defense spending pledges by NATO members as big news, stating that he's been asking them to hit that target for years now. It's also now referred to as the Hague Defense Investment Plan. Mark Rutte also hailed the 5% target and called on Russia to end the war in Ukraine. I'm Anita Sharma in The Hague. Back to Baku.
Leaders of NATO member states have been presented with a plan aimed at increasing defence spending to 5% of their GDP, up from the current 2%.
NATO leaders have been presented with a new defence spending target at a summit in The Hague, as demanded by US President Donald Trump. The plan suggests that NATO members should spend 5% of their GDP on defence and broader security investments. This is a significant increase from the current 2% goal, which was set at a summit in Wales in 2014. However, the new target will be measured differently. Members will be expected to spend 3.5% of GDP on core defence, troops and equipment, which matches the old 2% criteria. An additional 1.5% of GDP would go toward defence-related areas, such as adapting roads, bridges and ports for military use, cybersecurity and protecting energy pipelines. In 2024, NATO countries spent over $1.3 trillion on core defence, up from about $1 trillion a decade earlier in constant 2021 prices. But if they had all spent 3.5% of GDP last year, total spending would have reached around $1.75 trillion. The proposed increase is driven by Moscow's ongoing war in Ukraine and concerns about future threats from Russia. Pressure has also come from Washington to boost spending, especially as Europe faces the possibility that the US could withdraw some troops and capabilities. Still, not every NATO member is on board. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says his country can meet its military goals with spending at 2.1% of GDP. Spain approved the draft summit statement containing the new target, but made clear it will not spend that much. NATO officials say there will be no opt-out. Spain's spending will be tracked and, if it falls short, must rise. Britain, for its part, says it will overhaul its defence strategy to counter Russian threats, nuclear risks and cyber attacks by investing in drones and digital warfare rather than relying on a larger army. Responding to Trump's call for Europe to take greater responsibility for its security, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has pledged the largest sustained increase in British defence spending since the end of the Cold War. Compared to Russia, NATO countries spend a smaller share of GDP on defence, but collectively they vastly outspend Moscow. Russia raised its military spending by 38% in 2024, reaching about $149 billion, or 7.1% of its GDP, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. China, the world's second largest military spender, dedicated an estimated 1.7% of its GDP to defence last year. NATO members will be expected to meet the new target by 2035, though it could be reviewed and adjusted in 2029.
President Trump says the recent fighting between Israel and Iran may not be over, warning it could maybe start soon, despite both sides being exhausted. Speaking at a NATO summit in The Hague, Trump also commented on the war in Ukraine, describing his meeting with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy as warm and optimistic. Trump said Zelenskyy would like to see it end and pledged to speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin to explore the possibility of peace.
And they're both tired, exhausted. They fought very, very hard and very viciously, very violently. And they were both satisfied to go home and get out. And can it start again? I guess someday it can. It could maybe start soon. Very nice, actually. You know, we had little rough times sometimes. He was couldn't have been nicer. I think he'd like to see an end to this. I do. I think what I took from the meeting couldn't have been nicer, actually. But I took from the meeting that he'd like to see it end. I think it's a great time to end it. I'm going to speak to Vladimir Putin and see if we can get it ended.
Ukraine's President Zelenskyy strongly condemned the Russian missile strike on the city of Dnipro on Tuesday. The attack killed 17 people and injured almost 300 others, including passengers on a train and children. Speaking to the Dutch Parliament in The Hague, Zelenskyy said that since the beginning of the war, Moscow has used nearly 29,000 Iranian-made drones.
Everything it well. Many homes were affected, schools were damaged, and people were hurt. Even a passenger train was hit as it was simply following its route. The missile exploded right next to it. One way or another, life itself is the main target of these attacks, each one showing the true nature of Putin's war.
To discuss recent developments on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, we are joined by Alec Kasman, Director of Protect Ukraine Now. Thank you for being with us. Now, what do you make of the latest NATO summit and how can it be useful for Ukraine?
The best thing Europe and the United States can do today is invest in drone manufacturing inside Ukraine. They obviously excel in that technology. They have excellent drones that help Ukraine defend the front line. In fact, most of Russian casualties today are thanks to unmanned aircrafts. But Ukraine needs to scale that technology, and investments into Ukrainian manufacturing is critical at the moment.
Would you say that that military capacity is Ukraine's biggest need at the moment?
Obviously, Ukraine also needs air defense. As you have seen from recent news, the civilians continue to suffer. Infrastructure and no place in Ukraine is safe from ballistic missiles. So definitely air defense is a high priority too.
So off the back of this NATO summit, how hopeful are you that the focus will shift from the Middle East back to Ukraine?
Well, as you can see, it's a very slow process. Just the fact that NATO members are talking about increasing military spending to 3.5 to 5% over a 10-year period of time. This is a long process. I personally feel that they should expedite that schedule because if Russia is truly a threat to Europe, as everyone continues to say, perhaps Europe doesn't have that much time.
Thank you very much for your insights and for joining us on the programme.
Thank you.
Armenian security forces have raided homes targeting opposition supporters following claims of a foiled coup attempt. Police reportedly searched properties linked to the Armenian Pan-National Unity Party, founded by fugitive ex-official Migran Pogosyan. Local opposition figure Sevak Khachatryan said several residents were taken in for questioning. The investigative committee said it had disrupted an unconstitutional plot to seize power. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan blamed criminal, oligarchic and clerical circles for what he called a massive and despicable attempt to destabilise the country. The Iran-Israel ceasefire is now in its second day, but uncertainty remains. As evacuations continue, both sides are trading blame for alleged truce violations. Zainab Farajzadeh has more from Astara.
It is the second day of the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, but the situation remains uncertain. Both sides are now accusing each other of breaking the truce. Here, at the Astara border, crossing evacuation continues. The latest group of evacuees includes citizens from the UK, Germany, Italy, China, Japan, and beyond. These evacuations are being carried out with strict checks and proper documentation. Many people said they were thankful for the hospitality and good organization they found here. You can watch interviews with evacuees on our news report and on our social media pages. The ceasefire is officially in place, but people are still living, and the region is watching closely what happens next.
Turkmenistan's Foreign Minister Rashid Meredov and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio held a phone call on Tuesday to discuss bilateral and regional issues. The two sides reviewed political, economic and humanitarian cooperation and agreed to launch annual bilateral consultations soon. They also exchanged views on international affairs, including the situation in the Middle East. Turkmenistan reaffirmed its commitment to neutrality and peaceful conflict resolution, highlighting broad international support for its diplomatic stance. In what's being described as a historic milestone, Uzbekistan's president has made his first official visit to Mongolia. At the centre of the talks, economic cooperation. The two countries signed 7 agreements and pledged to dramatically boost trade, while also launching a new transport corridor through Kyrgyzstan and China.
According to the press service of the Uzbek president, this first official visit to Mongolia was described as a historic milestone in strengthening friendship and expanding cooperation between the two nations. At the heart of the talks was economic partnership. A trade house featuring a permanent showroom of Uzbek products has already opened in Ulaanbaatar, a real and walking platform for building stronger business ties on the ground. The two leaders also agreed on practical areas of industrial collaboration, where their economies naturally complement one another. These include joint projects in mining and mineral processing, agriculture and livestock development. In total, 7 agreements were signed. The presidents also agreed to increase bilateral trade by up to 20 times. In 2024, trade to Nova reached $20.4 million. Another key decision was launching direct flights between Tashkent and Ulaanbaatar this fall. And as landlocked countries, Uzbekistan and Mongolia share a common interest in building reliable trade corridors. The two sides agreed to develop these routes jointly with the support of expert teams. And ahead of the visit, Uzbekistan launched a brand new international transport corridor to Mongolia through Kyrgyzstan and China. The first delivery made it to its destination in just 8 days after a 45-kilometer journey by road. The route presents some geographic challenges as parts of it pass through the Altai Mountains, reaching elevations of up to 1,500 meters above sea level. But despite the challenges, this alternative corridor could play a key role in regional logistics, cutting both delivery times and costs for Uzbek businesses looking to reach the Mongolian and North Chinese markets. Fariza Kalimurzina, A News in Almaty, Kazakhstan.
The National Bank of Georgia has increased the country's international reserves by over $613 million since the start of the year. That's according to the bank's latest update. In May alone, more than $245 million were added through interventions on the B-Match platform. Total reserves reached $4.6 billion by the end of May. The National Bank of Georgia says growing reserves is vital for maintaining macroeconomic stability. The next update on foreign exchange operations will be published on July 25th. Now to Baku, where music, movement and meaning collide. For the first time ever, artists from Guadeloupe and Azerbaijan have come together for a vibrant concert celebrating culture and resistance. As Aria Fatih reports, the event isn't just entertainment, it's a powerful stand against colonial legacies.
Well, you can probably hear it and feel it too. The atmosphere here is electric. Right behind me, the Green Theatre here in Baku has been transformed into a vibrant, high-energy celebration of culture, rhythm and resistance. This is Rhythms and Dances of Guadeloupe and Azerbaijan, and it's the first time a concert like this has ever taken place here, and it's already in full swing, and hundreds of people have gathered here. On stage right now is Laku Veranda, a Guadeloupean group, and they're joined by Azerbaijani musicians in a fusion of traditional beats and shared storytelling. But this isn't just a concert, it's a cultural statement.
For example, you can dance, you can play any games, and I want to attract for this advent.
Organizers say tonight is about standing up to colonial legacies, especially in Guadeloupe, where France has long been accused of trying to erase local identity through forced assimilation. This collaboration is their answer, using rhythm, music and movement to push back and build solidarity across borders. Aria Fatih, A News.
Tonight, A News is broadcasting the haunting story of a soldier whose bravery echoes through history, yet whose fate remains a mystery. The Sun is a powerful documentary tracing the final known moments of Natig Gasimov during the First Karabakh War.
A soldier's final stand, a missing hero, and a haunting silence that still echoes decades later. A News presents the story of Natig Gasimov, whose fate in the First Karabakh War remains unknown, through the powerful documentary The Sun. Natig Gasimov, declared a national hero of Azerbaijan, went missing during the First Karabakh War in March 1992. He was last seen defending a strategic post in an ancient church overlooking the battleground in the Khojaly district, alone. In 1991, Gasimov voluntarily joined the Azerbaijani armed forces. His path led from Aghdam to the fierce battles of Khojaly. Natig's last destination was an old church which he defended with his 6 comrades. When they had fallen, Natig continued his fight alone, leaving an impression of a heavily armed group fighting inside. After fighting for 5 days alone without food, water or ammunition, he was captured by Armenian forces on March 12, 1992. Italian photographer Enrico Sarsini witnessed how Gasimov was taken prisoner after refusing to risk the lives of civilians. Armenians had reportedly threatened to execute Khojaly prisoners if the remaining defenders did not surrender. When leaving the church, Natig took the Azerbaijani flag flying above it, held it tightly in his hands and surrendered to Armenian soldiers. Later photos taken by Enrico Sarsini showed Armenian soldiers circled Natig in an interrogation. His fate remains unknown. The documentary by British director and screenwriter Karan Singh sheds a light on Gasimov's final days and the mystery that followed. With rare archival footage and first-hand accounts, the film brings one of Azerbaijan's most courageous yet undertold stories to the screen.
And to discuss the production behind the film The Sun, we are joined by the film's producer Eckhart Sager. Thank you for joining us. Now, what was it about Natig Gasimov's story that made you want to tell it in a documentary?
Well, in a way, this is not just a story about sacrifice. It's also a story about silence, mystery, and the search for the truth. And the story of Natig, in fact, has always been out there. There were rumors, tales of bravery, lots of unanswered questions. But then it was Talat Haydarov, the well-known Azerbaijani businessman, who showed me photos of the last moments of Natig Gasimov. And these were very moving. They really touched us deeply. And these shows Natig inside the church. They showed his surrender and the interrogation. They were simply chilling images. But that was it. 25 years later, nobody knew what happened to him. You could call it almost like a cold case file, like a police investigation into a missing person, a potential crime decades earlier. So I teamed up with Karan Singh, the UK-based director and filmmaker, and we embarked on this challenging mission to find out the fate of Natig.
So you've mentioned those photos there that you had. What other kind of research was involved in telling a story like his?
Well, first, I think it's important to understand that we, as filmmakers, were very much aware of the hostilities between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So we wanted to make sure that our film was balanced and objective. And we really didn't have many leads, as you said. I mean, we had the concrete photos. That's the only concrete thing we had. And then we had some eyewitness accounts. So what we needed first is maybe get to know Natig. And you saw some images there. We went to visit the family. We met the mother and the siblings. And to be very honest, it was extraordinarily emotional. The heartbreak was profound. But what we also found out was about Natig. Natig was a very tender human being. He was a projectionist who allowed for the poor people to enter free of charge. He was a person who saw the Khojaly massacre and then decided to volunteer. So we found out about Natig. That was critical. Then we went to see Sarsini in Italy. He was the last person to see Natig, and he told us a story firsthand. And very important, he was very afraid, as he said in the documentary, what would happen to Natig the moment he would leave. Also, Natig was never reported to the International Red Cross. And finally, of course, as you can imagine, the most challenging part was getting into Armenia and interviewing some of the key people in Armenia. And, we, of course, interviewed Vitaly Balasanyan, who denied ever having met Natig, even when we showed him the photos of Natig. But then we interviewed the General Romik Miktaryan, who immediately identified Vitaly Balasanyan from the photos. And that was a breakthrough for us. I mean, it really, a comparison of the photos was basically, didn't leave any doubt.
Was it important to get that across, Natig as a human, as well as Natig as a soldier?
Well, actually, it's a very good question, because in the end, it was what we wanted to portray is a human tragedy of war. And that's why we called the documentary The Son. In the end, it was a son. And this son has now, to a certain extent, shaped national consciousness in Azerbaijan, perhaps even inspired a future generation with his valor and his bravery, and maybe even reinforced the ideals of duty and honor. So it's very clear, I think, Natig Gasimov's spirit endures. But it is also a universal story. A teenager who volunteers to fight for his homeland against overwhelming odds and is then killed for doing his duty. So I think audiences worldwide can identify his strong bonds with his mother and sibling and his unshakable determination in the face of death.
And you've touched on this already, but tell me more about that filming process and the particular challenges that were involved in that.
Well, I mean, I think the key element was we wanted to make sure that we get confirmation on all fronts. We wanted to make sure that we identify the people who are responsible for Natig Gasimov's death. And that was done once by the General Romik Miktaryan, and then we went to Russia and also interviewed another Armenian soldier who was there during the siege, and he also confirmed that it was Vitaly Balasanyan who was there. So he also sadly confirmed the fate of Natig. So it was his own comrades who basically gave him away. And in the end, our search for the truth took 3 years to get to that stage, 5 countries. So we uncovered a war crime, nevertheless, at the very end of it. So we're very proud of that.
Now, you've touched on this already, the universality of Natig's story. What else do you hope audiences who watch this film may take from it or learn from it?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that for many people, especially in the West, the war in Karabakh, the hostilities surrounding it, are very obscure. So I think it's important to point out that under international law, Karabakh has always been part of Azerbaijan. In fact, there have been 4 United Nations resolutions calling for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Armenian troops from Karabakh that were never heeded. And Western publications largely overlooked these facts when covering the story. Now, Azerbaijan has liberated its lands, but there are hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced, the IDPs, the internationally displaced persons, and they want to go back to their homeland. So this is an enormous challenge for the government. And then there's the reconstruction, the rebuilding, schools, hospitals, roads. But I think perhaps one of the key challenges for Azerbaijan are the landmines, because I believe there are approximately 1.5 million landmines that have been indiscriminately laid in the territory, and it's an enormous challenge to clear them. So, yes, I think these are the things that I think are important to know.
Thank you very much for joining us on the programme. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much. By the way, we are also doing one more tribute to Natig, because we will be also publishing a book, a coffee table book, which is the making of the documentary and then the investigation into the war crime. It's a coffee table book as a tribute to Natig, which will be published later this year.
Thank you very much. Now you can watch The Sun on A News straight after this bulletin. That's all we have for now. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to A News.